wondrous indeed is the evening twilight. In the Jewish tradition, the day begins as the sun goes down, not when the sun comes up. Today, in the Christian tradition, we celebrate Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is directly tied to what is going to be celebrated on Monday, which is Passover. Jesus and Moses were two remarkable men, probably remarkably different in personality, but very similar in purpose and character. I want to talk with you first about Moses. Not much is really known about Moses. Like Jesus, there are long stretches in his life where nothing is said. And all that we know of him indeed comes from the Hebrew Bible. That's also true of Jesus. Jesus is not recorded in any place other than one short mention in a book by Josephus. We don't know a lot about him either. They are both famous as prophets. One was the lawgiver and the leader of the Israelites. The other was the man who stepped over the law as a literal matter and went into observing the spirit of the law. He was revising teachings that had existed since Moses' time. Now, Moses was charged by God with the task of bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. Like some other prophets in olden times, he was not happy to be given this task. He refused it. Not only is he supposed to have had a speech impediment, he was not sure about how to go about this. After all, remember, he was raised in Pharaoh's household. In secret, he was an Israelite, born of Israelite parents, but hidden from view as an Israelite until a much later stage in his life. And so he was not sure that he could complete this task that God had given to him. He refused it, essentially. In fact, tried to run away from it, and came back and finally confronted it. I think I'm going to switch my mode and do them side by side. Jesus did not run away from his assignment. On the other hand, he had a lot of trouble, apparently, accepting what was coming to him. On some level, he knew that his life was not going to end well on earth. And he spent a great deal of time in reflection on that. Now Moses confronted the Pharaoh and told him that he wanted him to set the Israelites free so that they could return to Israel. They were not Jews at that time. Judaism as we know it today did not exist in those times. It was the later teachings of Moses that helped give it shape and formed it into an organized religion. The Pharaoh, of course, we know, refused Moses' request. And then God spoke through Moses, Moses raising his hand to the heavens or his rod. He had a famous rod that could be turned into a serpent and back again into a rod. And what happened next? What did God do? I know you know the answer to this quiz. The plagues. How many plagues were there? 10. Very good. Can anybody name any of the plagues?
Frogs.
Yes, the frogs is the first ones everyone mentions. Locusts. I didn't hear what you said.
The smiting of the firstborn.
Yes, the killing of the firstborn, yeah. What else?
They ran on the water.
The water. The water turned to blood. Imagine finding all the water that you know in your life, blood. Turning on your taps, taking a shower or a bath, brushing your teeth with blood. That's a terrifying one. There were also the locusts. Somebody mentioned those, the plague of locusts. There's another one of lice or gnats that invaded. The livestock. The livestock were diseased, and they dropped. I used to know all of them by heart. But as I get older, all right, that's enough of them. Forgive me. The interesting thing about the plagues is they came across the land of Egypt, but they did not affect the Israelites. Their livestock didn't die. Their water didn't turn to blood. Their fields were not destroyed by locusts and other insects. There was darkness over the land for 3 days. That was another of the curses that came upon the Egyptians. The one that they escaped was the one where God instructed Moses to tell the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and to pass its blood along the doors of their houses, right? To signify to the angel of the Lord that this was a home where people obeyed that particular God. And they did. And that was the night of the Passover, the angel of the Lord passing over the homes of the Israelites, bringing death to the newborn children of the Egyptians. Now, of course, Pharaoh would not have been happy with any of this, and the next day, the Israelites gathered all of their belongings, very little, and they dashed away. They dashed away out towards the Red Sea, which is sometimes translated now as the Sea of Reeds, and they crossed away from Pharaoh's army. And I know you know what happened next. What happened?
They got drowned.
Yeah. The sea closed in, yes, over the Egyptian army and its chariots, always chariots named in this, and they drowned in the sea. And the Israelites came out on the other side. And then began the long, long trek into the wilderness. When I was in theological school, people said, why on earth did they have to wander for 40 years? I mean, come on. They were God's people. Why are they wandering for 40 years? And the usual answer that was given to this was that they weren't ready. They were not ready to be one nation of people, one faith of people. They all came from different places. They needed to go through exercises of leaving behind the experience of being enslaved so that they could learn to be free and so that they could learn to come into a new religious order. Moses was the one who was the lawgiver. He was the one who spoke to God. He was, like all old-time prophets, the mediator, the intercessory between the people and the divine. This gave him, of course, enormous status, enormous power, and a lot of stress. You know that he had a brother named Aaron, yes? And Aaron did many of the things that Moses wasn't sure he could do. And in fact, biblical scholars will tell you that it's sometimes difficult to tell if Aaron was performing a miracle or if Moses was performing a miracle. Was it Aaron who was speaking, who was 3 years older than Moses? Or was it Moses himself? But in the end, Moses is the one who emerges as, dare I say, the superstar. He is the prophet who is remembered for bringing Israelites to the boundaries of what is going to become Israel again. He doesn't go in it. He dies on Mount Moab, and his body is buried in an unknown place that is unmarked. This is something we hear of nowadays with people, that other people don't want to be found. You think about this. Criminals, in particular, have unmarked grave sites, and cemeteries refuse to bury them. And there are many arguments about this. But Moses was God's man. And yet it was enough, according to God's message, that Moses brought them there and died. He let the next leader, Joshua, I believe that was, take them in. And so Moses disappears, and yet Moses doesn't disappear because the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the books of Moses, are attributed to his life story and his teachings, his interpretations of all the laws of Judaism. Moses, of course, for a long time was not aware that he was an Israelite. He was living in an Egyptian household. And so, of course, when he discovered it, this must have been an enormous shock to his system. He was challenged to inspire and to shape an entire people. He was forced to develop a sense of purpose and commitment in the face of opposition and hardship. And through 40 years, he did that. He took these people with their tents and their herds across the deserts. Now, Jesus, too, was a wanderer. He wandered through the territory that we know as Israel today, crisscrossing through Galilee, inspiring his followers, his listeners, talking to them about how to live a meaningful life. He was not a lawgiver. He was, in a sense, a lawbreaker. He was a shaper of the law, bending it so that it was more inclusive for more people. And of course, he's famous because he challenged Jewish authority in his time. He frightened observant Jews, as he frightened the Romans who had conquered Israel. Now think about this. Moses took people out of enslavement by the Egyptians into a new place. Jesus appears in a place where those Israelites are enslaved again, in a manner of speaking, by the Roman Empire. Not the Egyptians, the Romans. They too, in a way, have lost their way. They too are the victims of the rules and laws and practices of another culture. And in fact, first century Israel was mixed in cultures. There was Greek influence there was Mediterranean influence there. And of course the Romans were there, along with the very stratified groups of Jews who lived there. Jesus was troubled as well. And he, just like Moses, climbed a mountain. And like Moses, he came back down, transfigured, with his face aglow. This only happens to very unusual people in the Bible, that their faces are illuminated. It's called the transfiguration. Their faces change, and people see it in them. In his own way, Jesus speaks to God just the way Moses spoke to God. Like Moses, he gives his life for the task that he has been given. He doesn't come right out and say, I'm here to die for you. That's not what he does. He leads by example through the teaching of parables and other stories, and he tells his followers that he knows he is going to be betrayed. And that doesn't bode well, does it? It's not a story with a happy ending when you think about him as a human walking on earth. But despite his fear, he goes on to the end. He too, I would remind you, had a number of 40 in his life. But in his case, it wasn't 40 years, it was 40 days. And where was he in the 40 days?
In the desert.
In the desert, yes. The desert has tremendous significance for this tradition because it's launched in a part of the world that has extreme desert conditions. Now, something to say here about these conditions and these men. They had followers. I don't know how many of you have followers. Does anybody have a posse? Groupies?
His Facebook account?
Yeah.
Likes.
Facebook might be the modern version of this, yeah. It's interesting to think about it, isn't it? They gain power because they are charismatic. Karen Armstrong actually calls Jesus a charismatic faith healer. And I think that's an excellent way to describe him. He's also a prophet and a teacher. Moses is a prophet. He is a teacher in the sense that he teaches the tribes of Israelites who are with him the laws that are coming. And there are a lot of laws if you read Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Many, many laws. I would not say that Moses is a faith healer, but he does inspire faith. That's why he's so afraid to become the leader of the Israelites. He doesn't think he has the stature or the presence or the charisma to inspire all those people to run away from the Pharaoh. And imagine what a daunting prospect that would be. Running away with hordes of people who were slaves. Slaves. Now, neither of these men would have succeeded in their tasks if they had not had a tremendous sense of purpose and a tremendous sense of commitment to what they thought their role was going to be. This tradition comes out of Judeo-Christian teachings. It's listed right here in the beginning of the book in our purposes and sources, that we are direct descendants of Judeo-Christian teachings. We are a very small denomination. I don't know if there are more Israelites than there are Unitarians, but it might be close. There are only about 180,000 of us in this country now. We've gone through ups and downs and ins and outs. We have not been persecuted in this country the way the Israelites were persecuted by Egyptians and Romans. We have not been asked in this country to die for our faith. We are asked instead in this country to live for our faith. We are not slaves to anyone except ourselves. And what we do with each other and what we do with this faith depends on our individual actions. It is up to us to help keep this faith of free thought, the search for truth and meaning, acceptance of one another, all of the 7 principles that we have to individually embody these ideas, and we have to bring them to the rest of the world. If I sound like an evangelist, I would say I am an evangelist. Unlike a lot of people, I'm not afraid to talk about my religion, my faith, and how I came to it. I find it endlessly fascinating, but that's probably part of what being a minister is all about. If I didn't find it fascinating, I'd just have to go sit down in the back over there. I want you to think about your faith tradition as something that you are proud of. I know that this place is not sacred when you're not in it. It's just an empty space. It becomes sacred when you come into it in agreement as to how you're going to be together. And we know, because I know that many of you were vastly relieved when you found this place and this tradition. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say, "Why didn't I know about this? Why have I never heard about this tradition?" Has anybody here said that to himself or herself upon coming in? Hands up. Let's see this. Yes. Yes, so it's not an unusual experience, is it? This is a haven. It is an oasis out of a different kind of world outside here in terms of religious practices and religious beliefs. This is the place that welcomes you as you are. This is the place that respects a search for truth and meaning. This is a place that values questions probably more than it values answers. And that is another characteristic that makes it unusual. When we talk about growing Unitarian Universalism, we're not talking about it simply in terms of budget considerations. And will we have enough money to, dare I say it, keep the minister or the music director or pay the rent? We're talking about it in terms of keeping something much bigger alive. We are the ambassadors for this tradition. We are the ones who can talk to other people about what goes on here and how this tradition came into being and what makes it so exceptional. There was a time about, I think maybe 5 years ago, when I interviewed to be an interim minister at the Staten Island congregation. And in the middle of the interview, one person said, "You're not a Christian, are you?" And I thought, oh, this person has issues. But of course I didn't say, "You know what, you've got issues." No. I thought about the fear that was in that comment. You know, and this is a lingering fear, a shadow fear that we don't often acknowledge as openly as we should, about identifying with our Christian past. So many people who come into Unitarian Universalism have left Christianity because of something that punished them, because of guilt, because of teachings they couldn't possibly live up to, because of rules and regulations that excluded them in one way or another. And they came into Unitarian Universalism finding a place more loving, more generous, more kind, and open-hearted. And they shiver at the thought of discussing Christianity or anything that comes from that background. So when she said that to me, like, "You're not a Christian, are you?" I said, "What is the issue with Christianity?" "Well, we're the only congregation in Staten Island that is not Christian. We want to be a place where people can escape from Christianity." And I thought, it was very strongly put, but I understood her point. She was not a Christian, and she felt oppressed being surrounded by Christian churches all over the place. And she wanted a place that freed her from that. Now, I understand that. I left a Christian background, It didn't mean anything. It didn't speak to, other than the music, which I thought was fantastic, and the liturgy, which was fantastic. I didn't believe any of the theology. And I left it. And I came to Unitarian Universalism. So we have left and we have come here, but we cannot pretend that we don't come out of the Christian history. We do. We exist as a response to Trinitarian teaching. We are a step beyond it, and in theological school, I asked my professor how he would describe Unitarian Universalism, and he said, it's a post-Christian tradition. And I thought, what a useful thing to know. It's a post-Christian faith. We came out of Judaism. We went through all those discussions in the first century about Jesus and who he was. We went beyond that through the 3rd century and the Council of Nicaea and the Arian controversy and all the other controversies. We went underground. We rose again, scattered about Central Europe, and in different places at different times, people started coming back to, if we're going to talk about God, let's talk about a unified God. The unified God that exists in Judaism. Gee, how amazing. I always think of Judaism not as just a monotheistic tradition, but as a Unitarian approach to religion, because Judaism does not discuss all those different aspects of God as though they're theological points that need to be named and identified. Everyone who has read the Hebrew Bible knows that that God was an angry, vengeful God. But they also know that he was idolized and worshipped by many people for all the great things that happened to the people who worshipped him. We are the ones who take these meanings and interpretations out into the world, and if we don't do it, who is going to do it? Who is going to know that you can come in here and use the word salvation without being struck by lightning? Or the word God without everyone throwing tomatoes at you? You don't do that, do you? No. This is one of the wonders of being here. It's one of the joys of being here. You can be a Christian Unitarian. You can be a Buddhist Unitarian. You can be an agnostic Unitarian, a humanist Unitarian, a rationalist Unitarian. One of my mentors, another minister, described himself as a rational mystic, and I thought, that's a great combination. A rational mystic. We allow space for many different ideas about theology and about what is sacred and divine. And in the midst of all that, we make promises to each other that we will give each other the space to explore all those different aspects of what it is that we hold sacred or important in life. I would say it's the guiding principle of being in this congregation. We make space for one another. We encourage discussion and questioning. It's not just freedom of the pulpit here, it's freedom of the pew. Now, I would remind you, because I heard it today from Gail, that this congregation is still very small. It's still alive. I first encountered it 14 years ago, and it's still alive and going, but it has not grown in ways that it could, and it needs to grow. It needs to grow not just so that you can keep going, but so that you can share what this place has with other people. It's no good, love doesn't grow if you don't express love, if you don't share love. And the more you share love, the more love comes back to you. And the same is true of being in a community of faith that focuses on bringing more love and justice into the world. My challenge for you is to do some hard thinking, a lot of discussion in the weeks and months ahead about how to continue building this place so that its message can go further and further, so that people who are out there so-called in the wilderness can come into what we call the big tent of Unitarian Universalism. Wouldn't it be great to double the size of this congregation? Wouldn't it be great? Yeah? And to be in that place that has been set aside for you, the place that Pat contributed so mightily to, for you and with you, it would be great. I would say, hallelujah, it would be great. I wasn't struck by lightning for saying that. So I want you to think about this seriously. I want you to think about the fact that you are the modern day ambassadors, evangelists, prophets for this tradition. Live it. Do not hide it. Do not hide your light under a bushel. Do not hide this congregation under a bushel. If the only people you know in this whole area are people who are members of this congregation, you need to get out more. You need to get out more.